Hi, boys and girls. My name is Miss Rachel. Today we are going to be continuing our reading unit. We're Unit 4, Week 3, and today we are going to be reading a story called The Moon Over Star. This is going to be a 2-day reading, so we're going to start it today and we're going to finish it tomorrow. That's just so we can pace ourselves and make sure we're getting everything out of the story that we can. So now, before we start, I just want to remind you of our essential question for this lesson. So, our essential question is, how do inventions and technology affect your life? So, just try and keep that in mind throughout our reading because we're going to revisit it towards the end. So, our do now today is to watch the video of the first man landing on the moon, which was a very exciting time when this happened. So, to keep in mind as you're watching the story, I want you to think about, how do you think that the people alive during the first moon landing were affected by this? Or, in other words, how do you think that they felt watching this happen? So, let's take a look at the video.
2, 1, 0. All engines running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11. 20 feet down, 2.5. Picking up some dust. 30 feet, 2.5 down. Take shadow. 4 forward. 4 forward. Drift into the right a little. 6, down a half. Contact light. Okay, engine stop. Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot. Okay, Neil, we can see you coming down the ladder now. I'm at the foot of the ladder. The limb footbeds are only depressed in the surface about 1 or 2 inches. I'm going to step off the limb now. It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Tony, this is so great you can't believe it. I believe it, Charlie. It's raining, Charlie. Look at it go, would you, Charlie? You got all your steering. It's great. Oh, this is going to be some kind of different ride. Hippity hoppity, hippity hopping over hill and dale. Da 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 da. Hippity hopping along. One ignition. Burn away, Houston. Vector good. We're burning flat. That's right. Looks good, flight. How's the base shot, flight? Roger. Stand by for splashdown.
Okay, so that was our do now video. So I told you before we started the video to think to yourselves how people were affected by this moon landing during this time when they were watching it. And after watching the video, it's clear that you can say that people were inspired when this was happening. People realized that you can have an idea or a dream, and with the right types of advances in technology, that they were able to make this dream or a reality. So people were just truly inspired at this time, and they realized that, years down the line, technology is going to continue to improve and continue to advance. And they were just really inspired at where that could take them in their lives. So the story, here's the cover of the story that we are reading today. And before we start, I just want to remind you that the genre of our story is a historical fiction. So we have been talking about historical fiction a little bit for the past 2 days. So I just want to remind you of the characteristics. So the 3 characteristics that stick out are that it includes a mix of fiction and historical fact. It is set in a real time and place in history, and the characters are portrayed in a realistic manner. So the story that we're reading today, what makes it a historical fiction is that they are talking about the moon landing that happened in 1969, which was what we just watched the video on. So, during the 1960s, the United States and Russia were competing with one another to see which country was more powerful. Russia beat the US by putting the first man in space in 1961. But President John F. Kennedy wanted to put a man on the moon before the decade was out. So, before we got into the 2000s, he wanted a man to land on the moon. So, as the world watched, astronauts Neil Armstrong, Edward Aldrin Jr., and Michael Collins landed Apollo 11 on the moon on July 20th, 1969. So I just included a picture of them. Excuse me, let me move myself out the way. Just so you can see what they look like. So this is Neil Armstrong. He was the actual first man on the moon. So his foot landed on that moon very first. So Neil Armstrong, Michael Collins, and Edwin Aldrin Jr. They were all astronauts upon the Apollo 11 that landed on the moon. So let's get to our reading. So before I start reading, I want you to look at this picture and think to yourselves, so this is our main character here. Her name is May. So what is May looking at? She's looking at the moon, right? And looks like maybe she's thinking about something. She's wondering what's going on. So I'm going to read that first page. And as I'm reading that first page, I want you to look at this image so that it can help you understand the text a little better. Once upon a summer's morning in 1969, Grandpa led the singing in church, the light of Sunday gleaming on his silvery head. Through the open windows, our voices sailed over Star, our town. Then we bowed our heads and prayed for the astronauts, Neil Armstrong, Edwin Aldrin Jr., and Michael Collins. If all went well, a spaceship would land on the moon today, and I dreamed that maybe one day I could go to the moon too. So now that we have read the first page, as we were looking at the image, we can say to ourselves that as May is looking up at that moon, we can think that she's probably thinking about, I wonder what the moon looks like so close, or what the moon feels like underneath me. And we know that she's thinking about that because we look back in the text and she says, and I dreamed that maybe one day I could go to the moon too. So that image helped us understand the text a little better. On to our second page. My Gramps thought the space program was a waste of money, but I knew he was praying for them too. I thought about the astronauts' kids and I wondered if they were scared. Scared, but proud. I know I'd be. I slipped my hand into my dad's and whispered, so only I could hear, please bless the astronauts' children too. So, who is the first person narrator in this story? Or, in other words, who's telling us this story? I want you to think that to yourselves. So the first person narrator of this story is May. So she's the little girl that was on our cover, and she's the one that's telling us this story. So I want you to ask yourselves, after just reading only those 2 pages, how do you think May feels about the astronauts going to space? So from her point of view, what can we say that she feels about these astronauts landing on the moon? So I'm going to pull up an anchor chart for us. And here, after reading those first 2 pages, I think we can say that May is concerned for the astronaut's safety. So I can go back and look in the text to try and find some details to support that point of view. So, like I said, our point of view is that May is concerned for the astronaut's safety. So I'm going to go through the text and see if I can find some details that support that. So the first thing that I noticed is that she says that she thought about the astronauts' kids. So she's thinking about the kids and wondering if they were scared. So that shows that she's a little concerned for the astronauts, right? Because why else would the children be scared? Probably because there's some concern, going to space for the very first time. Nobody has ever done this before. So then I also want you to continue looking, and you can see that she says that she whispers so only she could hear, and she says, please bless the astronauts' children too. So we know that she's praying for the astronauts. So let's fill in our anchor chart. So we see that May is praying for the astronauts. She's thinking about the astronauts' kids. And lastly, she says, please bless the astronauts' children too. So we can look at that and clearly see that May's point of view and how she feels so far about the astronauts going to the moon. Okay, now on to the next page. Once upon a summer's noon, my cousins and I scouted Grand's watermelon patch for the biggest one. It took three of us to carry it to a tub of ice, three and a half, counting my littlest cousin Lacey. We decorated the picnic table with pails of wildflowers. Then our chore then our chores done, we built our own spaceship from scraps we found in the barn. T minus 15 seconds. 12, 11, 10, 9. As the oldest grandchildren, I got to be launch controller and Commander Armstrong. Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Liftoff. We have liftoff. So now before we get to the next page, I want you to look at both of these images. So in our first image, we have Neil Armstrong, Michael Collins, and Edwin Aldrin sitting in their spaceship waiting for liftoff. And now over here in this image, we see May and a couple of her cousins kind of doing the same thing, but in their own pretend version. So I want you to see how you can see that contrast between both images. So they're both doing the same thing. They just clearly look a little different doing them. Now, before we go on to the next page, I want you to think to yourself, let's make a prediction. So I want you to think, what do you think Gramps' reaction to the moon landing will be? Use text clues to make your prediction. So I can use some clues in the text. So I'm looking at the book right now too. So I can use clues in the text to help me predict what might happen later in the story. And I can read on and make sure I pay attention to the details so that I can confirm or verify my prediction. So on page 316, Gramps says that May tells us that Gramps says, my Gramps thought the space program was a waste of money. So I think that when they land on the moon, that Gramps isn't going to be very excited about it because he thinks that the space program is just a waste of money. But I also noticed that May tells us that she knew that he was praying for them too. So maybe he will change his mind later on in the story, but I'm going to have to continue reading to find out. So let's continue reading. We closed our eyes, imagining with all our might the rumble, the roar, and the force of the Saturn rocket blasting the spaceship into the stars. Then we were rushing through space at 25,000 miles per hour. I wonder how many miles it is to the moon, Cousin Carrie said. I'd been reading the moon stories in the paper, so I knew. About 240,000 miles, I said, and some scientists say it's moving away from us an inch or so further every year. But I also knew that in May 1961, a month before I was born, President John F. Kennedy had said America would send men to the moon before the decade was out. Now that President Kennedy was in heaven, I wondered if he could see the astronauts. Was he smiling to know his dream was about to come true? So, as we're reading this page, I want to remind you of that point of view anchor chart we did earlier on the last, and we're going to create another one. So, on this one, I want to again look at May's point of view, and I want you to think to yourself, how do we think that May is feeling about the moon landing? So, our first anchor chart was talking about how May was feeling towards the astronauts, but now with this anchor chart, I want you to think about how May feels about landing on the moon, about them getting to the moon. So, as I am reading, I can see that May is excited and informed about the moon landing. And I know that she's excited because she's been thinking about it all day. She created that diorama with her cousins. And I also know that she's informed about it because she's giving us a lot of facts, right? So she talks about knowing that the moon was about 240,000 miles away. She talks about John F. Kennedy and that being his dream of sending men to the moon before the decade was out. So we can fill in our anchor chart and we can say that she imagines the rocket launch with all her might. So she closes her eyes in the first sentence we see, imagining with all her might the rumble, the roar, and the force. So she's definitely very excited. She also knows a lot about the moon. Like I was saying, she was listing those facts to her cousin Carrie. And lastly, she knows about Kennedy's dream to send people to the moon. So she knows that she knows a lot about the moon and a lot about what is going on right now. So she's definitely excited and informed. After looking at this page, I want you to think about what was on this page that helped prove the point even further that this was a historical fiction, that helped back that up. So, just to remind you, a historical fiction has events from history throughout the story, real life history. So, going back through this page, I can look for some history facts that prove this is a historical fiction. So I see where May is talking about President John F. Kennedy, and she said about him wanting to have men on the moon before the decade was out. And she's wondering now if President Kennedy was in heaven thinking about what was happening right now. So that just shows another historical fact that's in this story that proves that this is a historical fiction. So now, before we continue reading, I want you to look at the image on this page. So we got some nice bright colors. We have that rocket going into the space. So I want you to look at this image, and I'm going to reread the first part of this page so that you can see how much this image helps the reader imagine what is going on. So we closed our eyes, imagining with all our might the rumble, the roar, and the force of the Saturn rocket blasting the spaceship into stars. Then we were rushing through space at 25,000 miles per hour. So just reading that one part and looking at that image, you can see how that illustration really helps the reader understand what is going on in the story. So on to the next page. That afternoon, we were helping Gramps with the tractor when Gran hollered, "Come quick, they're landing." Gramps kept right on tinkering with the engine. The rest of us ran pell-mell for the house and squirmed around the television screen as it glowed with equal parts of the moon and the spaceship called Eagle. We heard the voice of the commander, Armstrong, directing the landing. "Forward, forward," he said. Then the newsman we all knew, Walter Cronkite, explained, "Man on the moon!" For a split second, we were silent. The whole universe must have been, as we waited, waited to hear the voice of the astronaut 25,000 miles away. And then, "Houston, Tranquility Base here," Commander Armstrong said. "The Eagle has landed." So I want you to look at this image, and there's a couple things that we're going to pick apart. So let's go back to the beginning where it says, Gramps kept right on tinkering with the engine. So the word tinkering means to keep busy in an aimless way. So why did the author choose that word rather than fixing? The author could have said, Gramps kept right on fixing with the engine, but instead used tinkering. And I believe that the author did that to show you that Gramps was not concentrating on the truck he was fixing. Even though he might have been trying to, he wasn't concentrating. And that's because there was a lot going on with the moon landing. So he was very distracted when he was trying to fix this. Another word that I want us to look at is the word pell-mell. So it says that the rest of us ran pell-mell for the house. So that means to run quickly or rushed. So I want you to ask yourselves again, why did the author use that word when he could have just said that they ran quickly? And it's because not only did they run quickly, they ran very rushed and kind of to run pell-mell is like you're running a little disorderly. You're so excited and you're running very fast. So those words in there help us create a better image of what is going on in the story. And then lastly, the author used the word squirmed, which means to wiggle or twist your body. You're squirming in your seat. So in that sentence, it reads, the rest of us ran pell-mell for the house and squirmed around the television. And as you can see in the image, they're all sitting around the television. But why didn't the author use the word sitting or sat? Why wouldn't the author use that? I want you to think about that for a second. So using the word squirmed creates a better image for us that these kids weren't just sitting relaxed and watching this happen. They were kind of wiggling around. They were excited. It shows a better image of what was going on. So they ran crazy in the house. They sat down. They're wiggling. They're so nervous. They're so anxious, waiting to hear from Neil Armstrong on the moon to see if it was a successful landing. So I just want to remind ourselves, because this is where we're going to be ending our reading for today. So I just want to remind ourselves of the prediction that we made earlier on. So remember, we predicted that we think that Gramps is not going to be excited about the moon landing. And we're going to finish up our reading tomorrow, and we're going to find out if we can say our prediction is true or if we need to revise that prediction a little bit more. So, because there was a couple key details that we looked at that May shared with us, that he was still praying for the astronauts, and he was tinkering on his car or on the engine of his truck. So there's a couple more details that we can add into our prediction, and maybe we can revise a little bit. But we're going to talk about that tomorrow when we get back into our reading. So for now, you're going to start onto your independent work. So I'm just going to go over the instructions for your independent work. So independently, you will go on your Google form and you will find in your Google Classroom. And the questions are from the first half of our reading. So make sure you use the skills of rereading as you answer the question. So again, you'll have all of the text in the Google form for you. And it's just super important that you do go back and reread, or if you need to, you can use this video and listen to the story again so that you can form the best possible answer on those questions. And then once you have completed those questions, you will have a short exit ticket to complete, and then you can finish up for the day and you're all done. I hope you enjoyed the first half of our story. And tomorrow we are going to continue reading that and see how Gramps reacted to the moon landing. I hope you have a good rest of your day. Bye.